Victor Hugo was right when he said there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Yes, the idea of freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Yes, that was the idea, but I declare that now is the time. And if America is going to have a chance at living out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, then we cannot afford for this nation or its leaders to have selective ambition.
Welcome to the Policy Lowdown, the podcast from the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, offering straight talk on the policies that matter most to Maryland communities. I'm your host, Kevin Slayton. One of the most important responsibilities of our state and local governments is to provide an education for our kids to set them up for success. In 2021, the Maryland General Assembly passed a landmark education reform and funding bill known as the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. It was designed to address the chronic underfunding of schools in some communities and also to make Maryland schools some of the best in the world. This legislation was the result of years of study and planning by a commission of education experts. This year, as the state faces a very historic budget deficit, policymakers are talking about slowing down and scaling back some of the goals of the blueprint in order to reduce costs. Today on the show, I'm joined by two dedicated education experts and advocates to talk about how the proposed changes to the blueprint plan could ultimately affect students and families across the state. Riya Gupta, she is the Interim Executive Director of Strong Schools Maryland, an organization that is powered by thousands of Marylanders across the state who are committed to equitable funding for schools and equitable outcomes for students. Welcome, Riya.
Excited to be here.
And Liz Zogby. She's an advocate for special education, including currently serving as co-chair of the Maryland Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition. Welcome to the show, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive further into what is happening with the blueprint and the state budget, can you each share a bit more about your personal backgrounds and what brings you to education advocacy specifically? Liz, let's start with you.
So personally, I have 3 kids, and I think that's where a lot of people start out becoming education advocates as their children go through public schools. We live here in Baltimore City. And I'm in my 18th year as a parent at City Neighbors Charter School, which is really a school community that trains up education advocates and to take a strong stand for progressive education and for kids and teachers. My youngest daughter is 14. She's in the 7th grade there and has Down syndrome. So that's another piece that has brought me to this place. And because she was included and has been included in general education classrooms, it's opened up a window into thinking about education for all kids with disabilities. And so about 4 years ago, we restarted the Maryland Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations across the state, individuals with Down syndrome and their families, and we do work in education advocacy for them.
Outstanding. Riya, what about you?
Yeah, so I don't have any kids. I am a youngin' in this space. But I came to Maryland around 7 years ago. And one of the things that kind of launched me into this education advocacy space was my master's in science and public health. My background is in public health. That's where I got my training. And I really wanted to explore, the integration of education into health, right? Because we all know that education is health, is wealth. And that's how I look at this world. Education is the base for all. And it's the reason I am here in this position and on this podcast right now. And I really, during that time, I was able to dig deeply into Maryland's education system on the back end through formulas and how things are funded. And looking in the back end of things, you realize how much inequity is baked in, right? So I kind of made it my mission to break down those systems because it's everywhere. So that's what landed me at Strong Schools Maryland, understanding how funding is so important for education and for the system to run properly. And yeah, 2 years in, and we have lots to do.
Well, I'm excited to have you both here. Education is so critical to the functioning of the state, and none of that's possible without the proper resources. So we've always talked about the blueprint on this program, but for those who might be listening for the first time, I think it'd be helpful for us to take a little step back and talk about how it is that we got here. Riya, can you briefly walk us through the reasons Maryland as a state pursued major education reforms and what goals of the legislation were they actually trying to accomplish here?
To answer that question, I think a little bit of a history lesson is needed. Let's go back to 1996, where we have a case called the Bradford versus the Maryland State Board of Education. So this was a case that was brought up that found that the state was not fulfilling its duty to provide schools and students with a thorough and efficient public school education. So that kind of spurred a lot of movement in this education advocacy space and reform space. So after that decision was made in 1999, there was the creation of the Thornton Commission. And it was in this commission where they deeply looked at the concept of things like the weighted formula, and it was the foundation of education funding today. From those recommendations and all that hard work done through that commission, there was a piece of legislation created called the Bridge to Excellence. It compiled all those recommendations, and it truly reformed school financing and funding formulas and made funding how it is today. However, when it passed through the legislature, it's a funny thing in history. We didn't really attach any funding source to this education reform piece. So in 2008, the recession hit. We were in despair as a state and as a nation, and the state took a step back and said, let's cut it. Yeah, let's defund it, basically. So
who was the governor then? I think it was Robert Ehrlich.
Robert Ehrlich.
Yes.
Robert Ehrlich.
I just think that's important to sort of mention.
Okay.
Being around at that time, the back and forth between he and the mayor of Baltimore, because Bradford sort of created the city-state partnership. Yeah. It's like who's taking responsibility? Who wants to be holding the bag? And so the fact that it doesn't have that funding, it's important to have that piece to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting because talking about being a parent and becoming an education advocate from the parent side, my children, right? My daughter was in first grade in 2008, so it was that baptism into, we have to always be struggling to make sure that our kids have the funding that they need. And I think there's a generation younger than me, because I've been at this for a long time, who have their kids in elementary school now, who weren't around for those fights, and they don't know that history. So it is important, I think, for folks to kind of understand how we got to the point where we are today.
Yeah, and it helps us understand the cyclical nature of what we're doing, right? We fund education, then we defund it. We fund it, we defund it. And so after we kind of cut Thornton and stopped really looking at funding education the way that it should be, we saw the true impacts, right? We know that funding is tied to student outcomes. What we saw was more than half of Black students were attending schools in substantially underfunded districts. We saw that students were not graduating ready for college or career. It was a true eye-opener for a lot of state leaders, and that's when they decided to look at it again, and they created a new commission, the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, also known as the Kirwan Commission, right? So they were charged with two things. They were charged with updating the Maryland's public education funding formula, and then also making policy recommendations to build a world-class education system for Marylanders. There are a lot of advocacy works, I think about 70 plus meetings of the commission, compiled recommendations to create that transformative vision of the Blueprint for Maryland's future. In short, the Blueprint for Maryland's future is based in 5 pillars. First is early childhood education. Second is hiring diverse and high quality teachers and leaders. Third is college and career readiness pathways. fourth is more resources for all students to succeed. That holds a little bit of special education work, multilingual work, and also community school work. And then the fifth is governance and accountability. So those 5 pillars are the base of the blueprint. It is a blueprint, it is the base. There can always be additions, adjustments, but this is what we need to get to that system that we require to make sure that all students succeed.
What a very interesting history it is. Liz, is there anything you would add to that? And why did you in particular see the blueprint reforms as important, particularly for students with disabilities, as Riya sort of pointed out in that 5th accountability element of this?
Sure. So in 2022, just as sort of the Accountability and Implementation Board was getting ready to pass their first comprehensive implementation plan to really take the pieces of the blueprint and tell us how we are going to do it over time. I and some other special education advocates spent some time really going through that implementation plan, and we wrote some comments to the AIB, to the board. And what we found when we really looked into the implementation board was into their comprehensive implementation plan is that students with disabilities receive more resources through the blueprint, but there wasn't really anything programmatic that was specifically intentionally including students with disabilities. So we asked for students with disabilities to be explicitly included across all the pillars. And at their meeting, right before they approved the comprehensive implementation plan, we were really pleased that they decided to add a work group to look at students with disabilities and what it would take to improve their educational experiences and long-term outcomes. And so we started then in January of 2023 advocating to get that work group off the ground. And we just finished our work, actually finished our last work group meeting yesterday. We met monthly. We had 16 topical meetings. We have a body of about 25 recommendations that came out to say, okay, the blueprint provided us with additional resources, but for students with disabilities to really partake in the promise of the transformational impact of the blueprint, we need to think about them when we're thinking about preschool, when we're thinking about building the workforce, when we think about what it means to be college and career ready, what it means to say that all children should leave school enabled for college and career. So that's been the work of the last year and a half, and I think going forward, thinking about how we're going to implement those pieces is going to be the work of the next decade.
These changes also came with a planned significant increase in state funding for public schools that was phased in over a decade. Why is money so important to achieving these goals?
So first, I think that we tend to operate in a scarcity mindset in schools, right? We try to do more with less, and it prevents us from dreaming about what our public schools could be and should be. And so we now are at a place where we have resources and we can use those resources to build the best public schools that we can imagine for our kids. And we don't know fundamentally what adequacy is, because I don't think that we ever really got an adequacy study to understand what it would truly cost. But we do have additional resources, and we are using them to do better training, more professional learning, to recruit additional teachers, to create staffing models that will hopefully retain teachers for longer, to do professional learning, to provide guidance, to do tutoring for struggling learners, to provide more services and interventions. So the money goes to the people and supports the people in creating the schools that we need.
So Riya, your perspective, why is money so important to achieving these goals?
Yeah, adding on to what Liz said, we know that the best laid plan, the best research plan, is essentially moot without adequate investments and money, right? Nothing will happen the way that it should if we're not investing and not putting money where the plans say they should be. Second, we also know there is research that shows when we invest in students, when we increase per pupil, when we increase resources, the outcomes are there. We know that student outcomes increase, test scores increase, right? Even graduation rates, attendance can increase.
So let's get to the real meat of this. Sue Fothergill, very dear friend of mine, longtime education advocate. Governor's budget comes out. She reaches out and says, hey, I understand he did some good things, particularly for fair share. But there's still some areas around education that I think we have, as Riya talked about earlier in the program, she's been able to sort of look behind the curtain and see sort of what's in the details. And so, it's often difficult to do, but let's talk about what is happening in Governor Moore's proposed budget. He's proposed several changes to the blueprint plan, a plan that is, in some spaces, particularly progressive communities, is a sacred cow. It was protected. And those changes are ultimately going to result in less money going to public schools, schools that have already been determined through the various variations of Thornton, Bradford, whatever it came out to sort of say we continually disproportionately serve children in poor Black and brown communities, et cetera. And so knowingly, these changes are going to result in less money going to public schools than they were previously planned. Riya, what would be the ultimate impact on students and schools if the General Assembly this session approves those changes?
Yeah. And if I may, I think I might want to expand on the proposed cuts beforehand, just to lay the framework of how devastating these impacts would be. So what has been suggested in this legislative session through Senate Bill 429 and House Bill 504, called the Excellence in Maryland Public Schools Act, which a lot of advocates are not happy with that name. There are a few very large changes to the blueprint. And I want to really emphasize that this is the first time that we're seeing such large proposals to cut education since the blueprint was passed, right? This is the start of what we were seeing in 2008. I like to summarize it into the 3 C's: collaborative time, community schools, consortium. Those are the big buckets. There's more, but those are the 3 big buckets. So in terms of collaborative time, and Liz can talk a little bit more about this, but collaborative time, in short, is the time teachers spend outside of the classroom on collaboration, planning, all of that. It increases student outcomes because instructional quality increases. This is a scientifically researched thing. It's based in data, it's based in efficacy. They're proposing to pause collaborative time funding.
What would that pause look like? Hiring less teachers, reducing hours? How would that pause? How does that pause look for the average person?
So this was collaborative time, and phasing in collaborative time was meant to happen over a 8-year time frame. It was just meaning we need more teachers in the classroom so then teachers can be outside of the classroom where they can collaborate. The ratio that we're aiming for is a 60-40 time, right? 60% of time in classroom, 40% out of classroom. Right now we're at an 80-20. This is over an 8-year period of time to get to that ratio of collaborative time. The issue is collaborative time sits in a weird place in the funding formula of the blueprint. So the funding formula of the blueprint, there's a foundation base amount. That's basically if a base per pupil amount that would educate the average, so-and-so called the average student. We know that average student most likely doesn't exist in Maryland, but that's the amount. Every year, starting next year, there was a planned increase in that base per pupil that would allow for collaboration time, money to be allocated for collaboration time initiatives. That next year was $163, and it would increase pretty exponentially over the
Per student.
per student, $163 per student. The issue is with this proposal to collaborative time, they're taking out that money, right? They're taking out that money from the foundation. The sneaky thing is, in the funding formula, there are amounts like funding for multilingual students, funding for compensatory education students, that is linked to that foundation base amount. So when you take money out of the foundation, basically the funding for multilingual and compensatory education students decreases over time. What we're talking about is, Liz, jump in. How much money are we talking?
Sure. So in this year, the impact for kids would be about $220 million just on the collaborative time piece. And then, as Riya said, that dollar amount that's baked into the foundation for collaborative time grows a lot over time. So in a 4-year pause, pulling that money out, we're talking about $2.2 billion out of public education. And then because it's a glide path, that at the end of that 8-year period, we were supposed to be at about $1,527 per pupil. That amount we would start the phase in 4 years from now. So if you look at the loss over the 8-year period where we would have been, we're talking about $6.2 billion just from that collaborative time.
That's
part.
just collaborative time. That's like the first piece, that first C, right? Thank you for those numbers.
Sure.
Yeah. And then the second thing I want to touch on with the proposals are a freeze in community school funding. So we know that community schools are public schools that are meant to address the whole child, understanding that, it's not enough to just come to school for some students, right, and be in a classroom. There are other factors weighing on that child, on that school, on that community. So these community schools get concentration of poverty grants. It's based in what schools have a certain concentration of poverty and get extra funding to form partnerships within the community, with local organizations, families, all of that, to provide mental health counseling, after school programming, food services, healthcare services, whatever the student and the school community needs to address that whole child. What the governor's bill is proposing is to freeze concentration of poverty grant funding at fiscal year 26 levels. Basically, for 2 years, the money will stay stagnant. And we know the harms of that. We already know that our school inflationary rates are increasing at a rate we can't even fathom. We know educational costs are rising, and we know needs are increasing. So these funds that are meant to address the needs of, students that need it the most, the students that are living in poverty, what we know is that the impact will be devastating to these community schools. The numbers are a little harder to crunch, but we know that, for example, for Baltimore City, the median loss for schools will be around $630,000 for that 2-year pause, right? But again, like collaborative time, it snowballs. It's not a saving, it's not a preserving of funds, it's a disinvestment. Do you want to add anything on community schools?
No, it's complicated, but again, the way the funding formula works, but it increases over time. And each one of those community schools in their first year of implementation designs a plan for what that community needs. And then and the plan was built on the idea that the funds increase over time. So a pause means now all that planning work and all those partnerships that are being planned to build these wraparound services for students and for communities will be unable to be implemented. So it really will have a very direct impact, not just on kids, but on their families and on their wider communities.
And I want to mention that the pause is slated to be like a 2-year pause. But we also know from history, pause is never just a pause. This opens a can of worms for, fully stopping, for, pausing for a longer amount of time, because we're in a structural deficit. We know we're not nearer to solving our long-term budgetary issues. This is a low-hanging fruit for a lot of people, something just to cut and to freeze and pause so we don't have to invest in our students.
What is the third one? Collaborative time, the freeze in community schools funding, and what was the third C?
So the third C is consortium. So the Consortium on Coordinated Community Supports is a really important provision of the blueprint. And what they do is they provide behavioral health services to students across Maryland. This year, they served 58,000 students with those services. In the original blueprint text, the consortium was slated to have around $130 million for fiscal year 26 and onwards to provide those services. This proposal in the governor's budget, you're going to be shocked, Kevin. You're going to be shocked. Changes that 130 to 40 million. 40 million. We know that in any case, behavioral health services are at a high time need, all-time high.
It's a $120 million decrease?
$90 million.
$90
million annual decrease.
Yeah. We need, and this is at a time when we know need is just increasing in terms of behavioral health services. Yet we're basically cutting it, and I don't think we fully understand what that means for the consortium at this moment, and what services and how many students they will even be able to provide services to for the upcoming years. And this is a flat out reduction over the next 7 years, right?
Yeah.
It was meant to be 130 every single year. It is 40 every single year now.
That's a lot. Take a deep breath.
Yeah.
That's a deep breath. We should all take a deep breath. Question, I'm curious, not to play politics in it at all, but is this something that the current governor promised to fully fund on his campaign?
Yes.
Okay.
And a lot of legislators as well.
Yeah. So education cuts are not the only proposal that would potentially affect people with disabilities, Liz. The governor's budget also proposes major cuts to services that are provided by the Developmental Disabilities Administration. So, Liz, how do these sets of cuts intersect to affect people with disabilities and their families?
It's devastating to think about this budget and this legislative session going after two groups of people that are some of the most vulnerable: school children and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And in both cases, I think there's a bit of a common thread where we identified a problem and we brought together experts, we studied the problem, we came up with a plan to gradually, over a series of years, address the support needs and services needed for these populations. And then when the rubber hits the road, we pull the rug out from folks. So when it comes to the DDA, we're looking at about $200 million cut this year. And actually a series of what they are calling cost containment measures that will actually affect fiscal year 25. So beginning immediately upon passage of the budget. I won't maybe go into all the details because it's a little DDA services are a little bit complicated, but these are basically Medicaid waiver services that folks that with intellectual and developmental disabilities get. And they allow folks to live in the community, to have personal supports so that they can have job coaches, help maybe paying bills or with food services, being in the community for community activities, recreation. But we moved away as a society from a place where we were institutionalizing people who had intellectual and developmental disabilities and instead having them be part of our wider communities. And these supports are absolutely critical to those experiences of folks in their everyday lives. So the changes involve things like we have a system of rates for paying direct support professionals through community providers. Those rates are set by the government, and we have two different rates in our state that are. It's called a geographic differential, so it's most of the state and then the area that's sort of in the capital region. And that series of counties, the provider rate is a little bit higher to make sure that folks, instead of working at an Amazon warehouse or another job with a close to the minimum wage but just above, will instead do this really important work as direct support professionals. They are proposing basically having one rate, getting rid of that geographic differential, which is probably going to put community providers out of business because they've built their entire businesses on this rate differential. We allow people who self-direct their services, who hire their own staff to provide support to them. We've allowed them some wage exceptions, so to pay a slightly higher rate if they live somewhere where it's hard to get to, or they have some kind of exceptional need that requires a little bit of extra support or expertise. They are proposing getting rid of wage exceptions. So there's a whole series of things that I think are really going to go right to the heart of the idea of community living. And then another area that they've proposed cutting is something called low intensity support services, or LIS funding. And it's $2,000 grant that people can get who don't get any other kind of support from the DDA. It's first come, first serve. They do it on a lottery basis twice a year. And it's often used by families with children who might have a few extraordinary expenses and they don't qualify for Medicaid yet. So it might be to build a fence in your backyard if you have a child who tends to elope, or get your child swim lessons, because we know that is an area of really significant safety concern for a lot of children with developmental disabilities. And that is all state money for that program, but it's a really small program. It's only about $5 million, but they've cut it. And haven't just said we're suspending the funding for a year. They're eliminating the program so that it won't come back. It really serves as a lifeline for families. Yesterday, the ARC Maryland and a series of partners had a listening session in the middle of the day, and 400 families joined that listening session to talk about the impact that LIS funding has had on their families. So yeah, there's, it's hard not to feel like we have communities that are being targeted because they are not powerful. Because that if the budget was going after corporate interests or any of a series of other kinds of things where we might see cuts.
You think so?
Yeah. There might be some powerful folks lining up in Annapolis. So
yeah, the good thing is that we have people like you guys on the ground fighting for those most vulnerable in our communities. I'm no longer a hip hop head, but when I was, there was a rapper by the name of T.I. had a song I liked entitled "If It Ain't About the Money." The 90 days that our General Assembly convenes, they've got one mandate. That's to balance the budget. It really is about the money. As we're going to talk about more in our next episode, you all are fully aware that Governor Moore has proposed raising $1 billion in revenue to prevent further cuts in essential public services, many of the ones that you've just mentioned. What is your message to legislators, particularly those who are leaders, those who lead and serve communities that are disproportionately impacted by many of these cuts that you've just described? Why should they be sort of moved to do more than just, give this a wink and a nod? What would you tell them?
So I had somebody ask me the other day, well, what would you propose gets cut? And I thought, that's not my job. That's way above my pay grade. I'm here to advocate for the communities that have entrusted me with helping to keep them organized and to have a message and to help them to learn how to advocate to their legislatures and to their elected officials. It's not my job to determine where there should be cuts, but I think that if we have established as a society, as a state, that there are services that we want to provide to our community members, that there's a world that we want to live in, and we've defined what that's going to look like. It's going to be great public schools. It's going to be people with disabilities living in our communities and being part of our communities. We need to figure out a way collectively to pay for that. And I think there are great proposals on the table. I think the Fair Share Plan puts a whole series of ideas on the table about how we raise revenue in a way that is equitable and that prioritizes people and the world and the society that we want to live in. And I'm grateful that the proposed budget includes some of those elements, but it doesn't include all of them. And I think that there's more work to do. It's unfortunate to me that the things that were put on the table to cut were the things that involved some of the most vulnerable folks in our state.
Riya, what would be your message?
Yeah.
What has been your message?
I think we can tell a lot about Maryland and our values based on where we put our money, right? We've always said we spend a lot on health, education. That's what we value. Right now, in this budget season, I can't say the same thing. And that's frustrating for a lot of Marylanders, not just advocates, just Marylanders. We know if we scale back, delay funding for the blueprint, we're going back to the status quo, right? A system that fails too many of our students. We need to stay strong on our commitment to invest in schools, because we can't go back to a place where achievement gaps are widening, economic opportunities diminish, and another generation of students are going to be left behind, right? That's the realities that we're dealing with, and that's what's at stake. We know that the governor has taken pieces of the Fair Share Plan and, listened to Marylanders and put that in his proposed budget. But that is truly the start. We have a plan that will create, $1.7 billion
Yes.
on the table. That means that we're leaving money on the table right now, and that's just the reality of it. And we're prioritizing corporate wealth and wealthy individuals over students, families, and working folks. That's what we're valuing with our what's being proposed right now.
Yeah, as we head into Black History Month and just leaving the national recognition of Dr. King, I'm reminded, and to the listeners, that he always told us that budgets are moral documents. They say an awful lot about what we really are. But I'm also reminded of the late James Baldwin, who would say often that it's hard to believe what you say when we see what you do. Mm-hmm. And so my hat's off to you all in this fight. You've got your hands filled. It's a major deficit we're facing, but there are communities that are dependent on on people like you, folks who you never know, they may never know you, but your voices and your advocacy is tremendous. So Riya and Liz, thank you both for bringing your expertise to the show today. Before we go, is there anything you want to share about ways listeners can get involved on advocacy on these issues? I know there's got to be something in brewing in the midst. Riya, you first.
Yeah. So Strong Schools Maryland is a part of the Fair Share Coalition, a group of, I think now 70 plus organizations ready to push for the passage of the Fair Share Plan this session. I urge every single one of you who is listening to find out more. Visit fairsharemaryland.org. Sign on to the coalition. Come to our coalition calls. Come to our rallies, because we know that Marylanders out there want this to pass. So we need to show our legislators, show our administration, show them that. Next up, the education advocates are on doing a lot. One of the biggest events coming up is on February 10th at 6:30 p.m. in Annapolis on Lawyers Mall. We'll be rallying to celebrate the 4th anniversary of the Blueprint, but this is not a celebration this year. This is not a celebration this year. This is a call to action. This is a push to protect the promise that was given to students and families. So we call every single one of you to visit bit.ly/Blueprint Day 2025 to register and show up and show out on February 10th. Liz?
Well, the only two things I'll add are a couple disability-specific events happening soon. So Developmental Disabilities Day, or DD Day, that's sponsored by the Developmental Disabilities Coalition, is February 13th. So that'll be a big day in Annapolis for the intellectual and developmental disabilities community. And then we also do, our Down syndrome organizations do a big celebration in Annapolis on World Down Syndrome Day, which is March 21st, 321. That stands for having 3 of the 21st chromosomes that cause Down syndrome. And this year we'll be having actually a rally on Lawyers Mall on March 21st. So join us for that. It's a wonderful day of celebration and advocacy.
Well, thank you all for tuning in. I want to thank my guests again for joining us. For those listening, you can find podcast archives and resources from this episode at mdeconomy.org/policy-lowdown. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email list or support the Policy Lowdown by making a donation to the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. You can also find the Maryland Center on Economic Policy at MD Economy on Twitter, Threads, and Instagram, and MD Economic Policy on Facebook. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
Those that would stand up, call our nation back toward justice and righteousness, are often bashed or labeled as socialist and unpatriotic. Many are labeled as instigators and rebel wild round.